My guest today is Nasozi Kakembo, author of the new book, African Decor Edit. Nasozi has spent many years traveling all over the continent of Africa, meeting artisans, making beautiful home accessories. You may have seen an increased interest in objects from countries such as Ghana, Zambia, and the Ivory Coast, not only showing up in designer homes, but also their likenesses peppering the shelves of your favorite big box stores, which makes her book so important right now. In it, she highlights the history, craftsmanship, and cultural context of 16 objects so that we can better understand the beauty of these pieces, which in turn makes us better educated consumers. She also shows us 10 homes across the globe where people have artfully incorporated African objects into their own unique blend of styles. Nasozi's story starts with her upbringing. Her father is Ugandan and her mother is Black American, both of whom greatly influenced her wanderlust and appreciation for arts and objects, leading her to where she is today. Along with writing this book, Nasozi is the creative director of nxstudio.com, an online source of home accessories from several African countries, all of which she designs or collaborates with the artisans she's met on her travels, bringing authentic, ethically sourced, beautiful wares into our homes. Nasozi Kakembo, welcome to the Slow Style Home Podcast. Love your book. So excited to have you here.
Thank you, Zandra. I'm really excited to speak with you today. Thank you for having me.
Let's just jump right in and start talking about this book. I think it's important, and you really make this point in your book as well, to understand how the cultural heritage across African kingdoms and tribes, it doesn't really line up necessarily with the borders of the countries
Absolutely.
that were set by, I don't know, by the Europeans. So why, as we're looking at objects then, and we're trying to understand where they came from and why they came to be, what's important for us to understand about lineage heritage?
Absolutely. The Berlin Conference dictated these kind of miscellaneous, arbitrary borders. But prior to that, there were people who lived across what are now these borders that previously did not exist. And as such, these objects, these artifacts, and customs and ceremonies were also occupying those lands and those livelihoods and lifestyles in the same manner. So what is perhaps a more accurate point of departure to really assess or appreciate or even categorize African decor, African objects and arts is really through geography or region or even linguistically. And it does get tricky because you'll find there's mudcloth in Mali, but there's also mudcloth in Burkina Faso and Ivory Coast, and maybe they look a little bit different, but then they have their own particular spin on it. In fact, there's a certain river where the mud is collected, and the river flows through various countries. So the geopolitical context really carries very little relevance.
And it's so interesting that you use the example of the river. And I just want to highlight in case anyone missed it. So mud cloth, the mud to make the cloth comes from a particular riverbank. And that connection to nature, I am finding more and more central to how I think about design and where we get our inspiration from. So the patterns found in design, the seemingly random dots or lines or whatever are actually not even random, right? They have this larger pattern to them. And so anytime we can make a connection between the natural world and what we're seeing in our homes, I get excited about. So mudcloth was a great example of that. Yeah. Fantastic. All right. I want to talk about the structure of the book. So the first part, you've got 16 different objects, which I think is so helpful because some of these things we are seeing more and more in the broader culture, in the broader design world, some of which, unfortunately, and we'll get into this, I think have become mass produced and lost all of their soul and right. But some of them are things maybe we haven't seen before. In either case, the only way to make them meaningful, in my opinion, is to know what the story is. Who made it? How did they make it? What are the symbolic meanings behind it? Or was it born out of necessity, or was it born purely for
Right.
art or whatever? And
Mm-hmm.
so these 16 chapters that you have on these objects are just so helpful. And I'm going to ask you to do the impossible, which is pull out just one or two that
Yeah.
you feel would make a great story for us to hear regarding how something was made. I think we can be blown away by the amount of work,
Right.
artistry that goes in. So what's one of your favorites?
One of my favorites, but I'll give the disclaimer that perhaps it's one of my least favorites because I actually tried to make it myself and I realized how hard it was. I gained
Hard.
an entirely new appreciation for batik when I did a
Okay.
batik residency in Ghana at the Kokubite Institute, and it was so hard.
Really? Okay.
There are no fewer than 10 steps from carving the blocks for the design to melting the wax. And there's a very particular temperature that the wax needs to be melted at. If it's too hot, it will be too thin and it will splatter, or it won't preserve the design from the stamp. If it's too cold, it won't be absorbed enough by the
Right.
stamp. So there are all of these different ratios to negotiate along the way, which if this is something that you've studied or it's been passed down or you grew up around it, it's second nature to you. But me bumbling over for this 2 week residency, I was completely overwhelmed.
Yeah.
So yes, batik is definitely one of those processes and objects that I hold near and dear because I actually got my hands on the process and from beginning to end, from ideation to conception to actually making it behind the scenes to finished product.
Okay, let's do another one. I'm wondering if you can tell us about a piece of furniture or a basket, some kind of design that has
Yeah.
some sort of cultural symbolism or something in it that we wouldn't know unless we learned about it.
So there are two objects that come to mind. The first is the Juju hat.
Mm-hmm.
When I first saw them for the first time in decor and not in their original context, they've always been on walls and they're front facing and we get to see the beautiful array of feathers. But my mind still didn't like make the connection or register that it is in fact a hat. You wear it on top of your head in the ceremony. So understanding that context and seeing it in that context when I was in Cameroon and how it's portrayed and also absolutely not utilized as decorative art walls there,
Right.
it's quite an interesting negotiation to make as somebody who wants to support the artisans who are making and selling this
Right.
work. But the Juju hat surprised me in that way, even though the function more or less is in the name. I still find
Yeah.
it so remarkable that it is in fact a hat that sits
Not
facing
a wall
upward,
hanging.
not a wall hanging, and not meant to be adorned in the way that we consume decoration in the West. So that was definitely one object that surprised me
And
years
so when
ago.
you talk to the women who are making these hats in Cameroon, what did they think about knowing that people were putting them on walls?
They're mostly what I found in speaking to artisans throughout the research and throughout my own work is that they're happy to be sharing their culture with
Mm-hmm.
other people around the world, and this has always been an element of African culture. They've always been traders throughout the
Yeah.
continent, whether it was like for the Silk Road or Mansa Musa and his caravan. This global commerce has always been a feature of African. The power dynamics and the economic dynamics have shifted over time, but
Mhm.
their initial response is they're happy to be sharing their culture and they also need and want to make some money from it. So
Yes, of course.
that's the response that I received.
Yeah. All right, let's get into the design because then the second half of the book, after you profile these different objects and the people who
Mm-hmm,
make them,
mm-hmm.
there's a whole other half of the book that showcases all these different homes all over the world. And you're basically showing us how different people incorporate some of these objects into their
Yeah.
homes or homes that they've designed. The first one I want to go to is actually the woman that taught you batik. And first of all, tell us about the institute that she created. I don't know if I can pronounce it. So just start there and tell us what it is.
Yes. So the Kokubite Institute is a multidisciplinary cultural and art institute founded by Renee C. Neblett in the mid 90s. And she was a former professor at private schools and even universities in and around Boston. She was at Milton Academy for quite some time. She was a fellow at Harvard University. And initially, she was just taking students for kind of study abroad opportunities to Ghana. And she decided to establish a home there. So focusing and creating Kokrobite Institute as a hub to bring people in from around the world, to expose them to indigenous philosophies from not just Ghana, but even pulling from other countries and philosophies from the continent. So whether that's furniture or fashion, but pursuing a circular economy in a more sustainable way and coexisting in the world.
Her home is quite stunning. It has this modern sensibility to me in that it's sparse. It's got these pieces of artwork, and some of them are large, sculptural, and they're given a lot of space, a lot of room to breathe around them. And you can just really tell how much she cares about each individual piece. She said something, and you pulled this quote, you highlighted this quote in the book that I thought was really interesting, that I want to ask you about. She said, most of what we consider modern has been influenced by the basic forms of traditional African objects. What did she mean by this?
She meant essentially the objects being attributed to now in the contemporary context are European cultures. We associate Scandi modern or Northern European
or mid-century modern.
Or mid-century, exactly, mid-century modern with modern design. And what she argues is that even the origins of that aesthetic really trace back to, if we can say, an African aesthetic, whether that is the Chiwara from Western Africa or Baule, or even certain cultures from the present day Democratic Republic of Congo. There are certain visual characteristics that we can somewhat categorize as African. So
I'm thinking about things like the legs of a stool, the shape of a leg of a stool, or the geometric repeating pattern on a
exactly
cloth, that kind
of thing. Yeah,
okay.
During World War II and post World War II, there was a new aesthetic that emerged from Europe that was far more refined and streamlined.
Right.
And that became the modern movement. And what many of those practitioners referred to were African objects. And I think of those who, in fact, cited and credited, we had Picasso and Matisse made it very clear that's who and what they were referencing. With Matisse's cutouts phase, he was referring to and had been inspired by and had studied Kuba cloth from the Kuba Kingdom and in the Democratic Republic of Congo and on. So that's what she means. And that's what I mean when we say that the roots and the foundation of modernism really go back to some of these very foundational aesthetics and characteristics from various aspects of African design.
I think it's so cool to learn the history of something and the lineage and how, because it's all about humankind taking something. The very first thing we took from was nature itself as the inspiration, right? And then changing a little bit, twisting, put their own little twist on it, changing. Maybe it's the color that changes, the shape or whatever, or even how it's used. And it's just, we're just standing on each other's shoulders, building and building. And it's really a beautiful thing. And then it has the dark side of appropriation and stealing and all that kind of stuff. But the creative practice of it is very beautiful.
Yes, I agree. I agree.
Speaking of this idea of appropriating and trying to bring things into our homes, especially if it's not of our own heritage, our own culture, respectfully, which I agree with you. I feel like there's a part of me that feels, it's not right for me to bring in things into my home that are not from my own culture. That in and of itself feels, I don't know, like disrespectful. I don't have a claim to it, maybe. But I love it. And I feel like if I learn about it, then there's that other argument that you're saying is, yes, but you could be helping someone who's actually making it and respecting their culture and where it's coming from. That, of course, that's the side of the spectrum that I'm encouraging. And I want to bring up a kind of a funny story. So in your book, one of the people that you highlight, a designer that you highlight, is DeBito. I interviewed him several
Oh,
years ago when he
okay.
was mostly doing photography for Justina Blakeney.
Yes.
So I
Yeah.
interviewed her a gazillion years ago. Then I interviewed him.
Oh,
But this is a long time ago. But anyway, I remember when he told the story on the show about this wall. It was in a
okay.
hotel in South Africa.
Yes.
This wall of baskets. It was a tall wall full, just absolutely full of baskets. And it
Yeah.
was so impactful. It was so beautiful to see that artwork, that artistry, but to see them displayed in that way en
Yeah.
masse. And I loved it. He loved it. He was sharing an example of how travel can inspire us. And I always talk about to people, bring stuff into your home from your travels for sure. And he did literally.
Yeah.
So he's got a whole wall
Yes. Yes.
of baskets that he acquired when he was over there, and that you share that in the book. And the thing is that I feel like not long after he did that, he's got a huge Instagram following. I started seeing African so-called baskets. They weren't specifically from any particular part of Africa, produced and sold in big box stores.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it made me so sad. On the one hand, I was like, oh, good. I'm glad people are appreciating the design, but who is this helping? Who's getting paid for this? How are they being made? Are they even being made by hand? Does anybody really know what designs symbolize or the colors mean or whatever? So you do spend a time in your book and on guiding us toward what we call ethical shopping. Just a little bit. What do we look for? How do you know?
Right. So that's the tricky part, is sometimes you don't know. And I'll use a very topical example because this just happened on Monday night. But Emma, who's in my book, her home in London is featured, as well as artisans that she has worked with in Cote d'Ivoire. And I was scrolling on Pinterest and this sponsored ad pops up on my Pinterest feed, and it's Emma's pillow. And I get all excited and I'm like, oh, Emma's pillow, her weavers in Cote d'Ivoire. I instantly recognized the pillow because I worked with her intimately. I know her business and her brand, 5-6 Textiles, intimately. And then I look closer and I press the link and it's on Target's website. And it is not her pillow. It is not her artisans. But when I tell you stitch for stitch, it's her design. And I sent it to her and she was shattered. She had no idea that this was happening. So I happen to know that, but had I just been a regular shopper in Target or on the website, I would have been drawn to it. I wouldn't have had that reference point, and I would have loved it, and I would have bought the pillow for $20 because I would have been none the wiser. So I really believe that this book as a tool / index is a point of departure for even being able to visually make the connection to know, okay, when I see this thing, I at least know that it's African. So then the next step would then be to, if you're shopping in person, to look at the product tag and to see where it comes from. Where does it define the country of origin, or is it giving a vague imported source of origin? If it's imported, that's a red flag that they're trying to obscure the origin. Because if it is in fact authentically made in the country of origin by the source community, then they'll celebrate that fact.
Why wouldn't they say that? Exactly.
The only reason that they would admit that information is to obscure the fact that it was mass produced in some place that has nothing to do with the story behind the object.
Right. So the first thing, look to see if there's a country of origin. The more specific, the better. The region, whatever. And then what's the second thing to look at?
So the second thing to look at, so that's if you're in a big box store or if you're online. If you are at a flea market or at an independent shop, I really believe in prioritizing buying from African artisans or people with an African connection, because the money and the benefits of the transaction should get as close to the community where they come from as possible. But there is also a very storied past between non-African cultures benefiting from African culture. And so to the extent that you can, I believe in sourcing from the source and buying as close to an African artisan, an African person as you can, as a preferential way of shopping. Right. And if you can't, because it's not always possible, at least in making sure that person, that business has some commitment to or interest in the well-being of that community. Have they traveled there? Do they have family there? Do they know where the object comes from? Or is this just a one-off trendy thing for them? But if they've demonstrated a commitment and a genuine interest, then I think that that's valuable and that's permissible.
Yes. Okay, great. All right. Back to the design a little bit more. In all of these homes, people they all seem to be pretty good at mixing together different styles, eras, cultures, and even sensibilities in terms of style. And that half of the book teaches us that. The first half is teaching us about provenance, and the second half is really teaching us about design. Let's just talk about your own home as an example, because it is in the book as well. And you've got this very particular 1970s style home. Tell us a little bit about how you approach that mix from a design perspective.
Yeah. So I have to say, actually, the first kind of laboratory where I got to experiment with blending styles was, in fact, my brownstone apartment in New York, in Brooklyn. And that was my first home once my son was born, and that home was replete with original details, 1800s classic brownstone details, which I didn't, necessarily think was my aesthetic, but I totally leaned into it, and for the first time really got to experiment with superimposing or blending my own aesthetic, which I was actually still figuring out at that time. But bringing in something that you wouldn't necessarily think would work together, and discovering that it in fact does enhance, because what some of the original materials were, what the palettes were, and those end up speaking to each other. So fast forward to years later, when I purchased my first home, and like you said, it's a very 1970s, that mid-century modern feel. And so it was, in a sense, to me, the perfect palette, because it was stripped of any adornment and I got to do it all myself. What I really focused on when searching for a home was an abundance of natural light. But what the Brooklyn experience really taught me in terms of storage or layout, and also being able to adapt the layout to, my needs and my son's needs as he was getting older. And it was all a very kind of formative design experience for me. And to this day has really influenced my own design choices and design practice, because I always look for modular solutions or furniture that is multifunctional. And so in that sense, my settings tend to be more sparse than perhaps the average, because I don't look to just arbitrarily fill a space. I always start with, how do we use this room? How are we using this space? And then layering in furniture based on those needs, but not, oh, that corner is empty, I have to put something in that corner. And I really love what that taught me about living with less, or what we consider less, but in fact it's a very abundant experience and lifestyle for me, because your possessions have more than one life, they have more, they carry more than one function, and that to me is abundant, as opposed to living with less. It's not less, it's more.
Okay, I love all of that. So in terms of marrying, I can see in your background right now, you've got the softness of the woven bowls, the shape is soft, you've got something hanging. Is it part of a light fixture behind
you? It is a light fixture. It looks like a hat on me, but there you go.
Okay, yeah. I figured it was a light fixture, that's got raffia hanging down, and you've got a beautiful pillow. It might be Batik, I'm not sure.
Yes, this one is also Batik from Ghana.
Okay, so you've got these, and all of those elements feel soft to me. They're natural. They've got natural organic shapes and everything. And were you at all concerned that, that's not going to work with this very angular, very sparse, non-decorated kind of 1970s home? Or were you excited about that juxtaposition?
I almost felt like it needed that juxtaposition to balance out kind of I don't even know so much that it was a conscious way that I looked at it. Okay, I need to soften this up in this way, but I do know how my body and my mind respond when I'm in a space that's very stark, or when I'm actually in a space that's too large. I'm like a total agoraphobe. I need to make things feel a little bit more cozy. So even adding this light fixture was a huge deal for me, because it made what is otherwise a cathedral ceiling and a large room feel smaller for me, which
Yeah,
is
yeah.
important for
Right,
me
right.
to
It's like
be able
when
to.
we swaddle babies, right? Newborns. It's like they
Exactly.
want to feel that kind of sense of security. And
Yeah.
one last question about the design that's throughout the book. Are there any homes that really stood out to you where the homeowner or the designer was using a piece in a way that was really interesting to you or different, surprising?
Yeah. An object that comes to mind immediately is the three-legged Ethiopian chair.
Yeah.
And it's in the home of Nina Farmer in her home in Martha's Vineyard. And it's also in my friend Jody's home. She's moved like 20 times in the past like 16 or 15 years.
Okay. Okay.
And in the first home, we were neighbors. And I remember the chair in that home. And subsequently remember the chair in other homes of hers. And it was always such a statement wherever and however she placed
Right.
this chair. And so in her first home, when we met, I think it was in the living room. Then at some point, it migrated to her primary bathroom. And then when I finally photographed her current home for the book, it was in the kitchen next to, I think, a telephone or something. And then more recently, I discovered that she moved it to her weekend home in upstate New York. So even just seeing how these pieces that are made well and with intention and care and are authentic and original, they last, they
Yes.
move with you, they grow with you. And so for me, that's really what that Ethiopian chair symbolizes. And then in Nina's home, I love that juxtaposition in which Nina has placed this Ethiopian chair in the dining room with a piece of local art made in Martha's Vineyard, and they work
Mm-hmm.
together.
Yeah.
And that's also why I chose that photograph to open up the interior design section in the book.
And also, I think it's in her home, in her kitchen. I think she's got long shelves, and she's
Mm-hmm.
got a lot of baskets and what look to be some other kind of like clay vessels or something. And I love
Yeah.
how she put them there because there's space around them. They really breathe, and you really appreciate the silhouettes of them. So
Yes. Yes.
seeing them all together makes this beautiful statement. And I really loved how
Absolutely.
she did that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. She did a great job.
All of the homes are really beautiful, very cool, very eclectic looking,
Yeah. Thank
beautiful
you.
mix of cultures and personal preferences and passions. And so I thoroughly enjoyed that half of the book as well. Nasozi, thank you so
Amazing.
much for coming on the show. This has been really delightful.
Yes, thank you too, Sandra. You've been fun to speak with, and again, love the questions and loved our tangents. This
Good,
has been a lot of fun.
good. Yes.